In the spring of 1965, in a research laboratory in Wilmington, Delaware, a man whose entire job was to push liquids through a spinneret refused to do it. The liquid had been brought to him by a chemist named Kwolek. It was cloudy, and it was thin, and it looked wrong. Every polymer solution he had ever spun was clear and thick, something like warm honey. This one was watery, with a dull sheen of skimmed milk. And to a man responsible for equipment that could be destroyed by solid particles, cloudy meant contaminated. He told her no. She asked again. The record does not preserve his name, and it does not tell us how many times she came back to his door, but it tells us that eventually he gave in and ran the batch. What came out the other side did not break. That is not a figure of speech. When the fiber was clamped into the machine that measures how much force a thread can take before it snaps, the number that came back was so far outside the expected range that both of them assumed the instrument had failed. Kwolek ran the test again. Then she ran it a third time. She had made the strongest fiber human beings had ever produced, and for several days in 1965, the only two people on Earth who knew it existed both believed they were looking at a mistake. You have probably heard that this material was created for the military, that it was designed for soldiers, or for war, or for some classified defense program that later trickled down to civilian life. It was not. The batch that man did not want to spin was part of a project to make automobile tires lighter, because a group of executives in Delaware were worried about the future price of gasoline. So how does a rejected jar of cloudy liquid made to save fuel end up as the last thing standing between a bullet and a police officer's chest? To answer that, you have to understand what DuPont thought it was doing in 1964, which had nothing to do with saving anyone's life. The company had spent 2 decades living off the success of nylon, the synthetic fiber that had come out of the same building a generation earlier, and it had learned an expensive lesson from that experience. Nylon had been an accident of pure research, a fiber discovered by a team that had been given money and told to explore. The company had spent the years since trying to make lightning strike twice on purpose. By the mid-1960s, DuPont's research directors had settled on a specific target. Their forecasters believed the United States was heading toward a gasoline shortage. That prediction turned out to be correct, though it would arrive later and more violently than anyone in Wilmington expected. If fuel was going to become scarce and expensive, then every pound of weight in an automobile was going to matter, and one of the heaviest components in a car that almost nobody thought about was the tire. A radial tire is not simply rubber. It is a composite structure, reinforced internally with cords that hold its shape under load and heat. And in 1964, those cords were largely steel. Steel is strong, and steel is heavy. If a synthetic fiber could be made stiff enough and strong enough to replace steel belting in a tire, a car would carry less weight, burn less fuel, and travel further on a gallon. That was the assignment. Not armor, not defense. Better mileage. The chemist handed a piece of that problem had not intended to be a chemist at all. Kwolek was born in 1923 in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, an industrial town northeast of Pittsburgh, into a family of Polish immigrants. Her father, Chester, was an amateur naturalist who took her walking through the woods and taught her to collect and label what she found. He died when she was 10 years old. Her mother, Nellie, worked as a seamstress, and the house was full of fabric, patterns, and the practical business of turning cloth into clothing. Kwolek later said that she considered becoming a fashion designer, and that her mother talked her out of it on the grounds that she was too much of a perfectionist to survive in that trade. It is worth sitting with the shape of that for a moment. The woman who would eventually invent the fiber that reinvented protective clothing was steered away from clothing by her own mother and toward chemistry, because she was told she cared too much about getting things exactly right. She studied chemistry at Margaret Morrison Carnegie College, the women's college of what is now Carnegie Mellon University, and graduated in 1946. She wanted to be a doctor, Medical school cost money she did not have, so she went looking for temporary work in industry, intending to save for tuition and leave. She interviewed at DuPont with a research director named Hale Charge. At the end of the conversation, she told him she had another offer and needed an answer quickly. Charge called his secretary into the room and dictated her offer letter while she sat there. She took the job to fund medical school. She stayed 40 years and never went. The work she was doing in 1964 belonged to a field that had barely existed 20 years earlier. Making a synthetic fiber means building enormous molecules out of small ones, chains of repeating units linked end to end, and then persuading those chains to line up alongside each other in the same direction. Alignment is everything. A fiber whose molecules run parallel to its length is strong. A fiber whose molecules are tangled in every direction is weak, no matter what it is made of. For nylon and for polyester, the alignment had to be forced. The polymer was melted or dissolved, extruded through a spinneret, and then physically stretched, sometimes several times its original length, to drag the tangled chains into line. It worked, and it produced fibers that changed the world, but it was a process of correcting a problem after the fact. Kwolek was working with a different class of compounds, aromatic polyamides, molecules built on rigid ring structures rather than flexible chains. In theory, these should produce a stiffer, more heat-resistant fiber. In practice, they were difficult to work with. They refused to melt without decomposing, and the search for a solvent that would dissolve them without destroying them consumed months. Then, one of her preparations came out wrong. A polymer solution, in the experience of every person in that laboratory, was supposed to be clear and viscous. It should pour like syrup and it should look like glass. What Kwolek had in front of her was cloudy, and it was thin enough to slosh. Her own description of it, repeated many times over the following decades, was that it looked like buttermilk. By every convention of the field, that solution was ruined. Cloudy meant undissolved particles. Thin meant the polymer chains had broken and the molecular weight had collapsed. Either fault on its own was reason enough to pour the batch out and start again, and there is no question that many chemists would have done exactly that. She did not. She filtered it, examined it, and decided it should be spun. Which is when she walked it down to the man who ran the spinneret, and he told her he would not put it in his machine. His caution was reasonable. A spinneret pushes liquid through holes finer than a human hair, and solid particles will block those holes and damage expensive equipment. He was protecting the instrument from what he was certain was a contaminated batch. He said no, and she came back, and he said no again, and at some point over the following days, he agreed to run it rather than keep arguing. The thread that emerged was stiffer than anything either of them had handled. Placed under tension, it did not stretch the way a synthetic fiber was supposed to stretch. It held, and then the instrument reported a result that neither of them believed. The fiber was roughly 5 times stronger than steel on an equal weight basis, and stiffer by a margin so large that Kwolek's first assumption was equipment failure. Her second assumption, after repeating the test, was that she had somehow contaminated the sample with something else. Only after several repetitions did she accept that the numbers were describing what was actually in front of her. Here is the part that turns this from a lucky accident into a piece of science. The 2 properties that had made everyone certain the batch was ruined were the same 2 properties that made the fiber extraordinary. Ordinary polymer molecules in solution behave like cooked spaghetti. They are flexible. They coil, they tangle around each other at random, and a liquid full of tangled coils is thick and clear. That is why every solution in that laboratory had been thick and clear. The thickness was the tangling. Kwolek's molecules were not flexible. The ring structures in the backbone made them rigid like uncooked spaghetti rather than cooked, and rigid rods in a crowded solution cannot tangle. They do the only thing geometry permits. They line up spontaneously into small domains where every rod points the same way. A liquid whose molecules have arranged themselves into ordered regions is a liquid crystal. Those ordered regions scatter light, which is why the solution was cloudy, and rods that are already lying parallel slide past one another with very little resistance, which is why the solution was thin. The cloudiness was the alignment. The thinness was the alignment. The solution looked broken because the molecules had already done, on their own and in the beaker, the thing that every other fiber process had to achieve by brute force afterward. When that liquid was pushed through a spinneret, the already parallel rods locked into place along the axis of the thread. There was no tangling to undo because there had never been any tangling. The fiber came out of the machine with a molecular order that stretched nylon could only approximate. That is the kind of thing this channel exists to find, and if it is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing and takes about a second. The rest of this story gets stranger. Turning that discovery into a product still took years and other people. A DuPont chemist named Paul Morgan had developed much of the low-temperature chemistry that made this class of polymers workable, and he and Kwolek had earlier collaborated on the demonstration known as the nylon rope trick, in which a continuous thread is drawn by hand from the boundary between two liquids. Another DuPont scientist, Herbert Blades, solved the industrial spinning problem, working out the solvent system and process conditions that allowed the fiber to be produced at scale rather than in a laboratory beaker. DuPont named the result Kevlar and brought it to market in 1971. And then, having spent years and a great deal of money developing a fiber to reinforce automobile tires, the company discovered that the tire industry was only the beginning of the list. Kevlar went into tires, and it is still in tires today. It also went into brake pads, into ropes and cables, into the sheathing that protects fiber optic lines buried under streets, into boat hulls, into aircraft components, into cut-resistant gloves. If you have a pair of work gloves in a drawer with a fiber liner sewn into the palm, there's a reasonable chance you are looking at Kwolek's cloudy batch. But the application that would define the material for the next 50 years did not come from DuPont at all. It came from a man at the United States Department of Justice who read about a new fiber and thought about a problem that had nothing to do with cars. The problem was that American police officers were being shot, and the equipment available to them was close to useless. Body armor at the start of the 1970s meant one of two things. It meant steel or ceramic plates, which stopped bullets and were heavy enough that no officer would wear them through an 8-hour shift. Or it meant the ballistic nylon flak jacket developed during the Second World War and the Korean War, which had been designed to stop shell fragments and slow shrapnel. Against a handgun round fired at close range, the flak jacket was not a serious answer. The result was a piece of arithmetic that everybody in law enforcement understood and nobody could solve. Armor that worked was too heavy to wear. Armor light enough to wear did not work. An officer sitting in a patrol car had no practical protection against the most common weapon he was likely to face. Lester Shubin was a program manager at the National Institute of Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice, a research arm of the Justice Department that funded work on police technology. Shubin had a background in chemistry and materials, and when he learned about the fiber DuPont had developed for tire cord, he asked a question that had apparently not occurred to anyone at DuPont. If it is strong enough to replace steel, what happens when you shoot it? Shubin and a colleague, Nicholas Montanarelli, began a testing program to find out. They built layered fabric panels from the fiber and put them through ballistic testing, working out how many layers were needed to stop specific handgun rounds and how the layers behaved on impact. The mechanism turned out to be different from the way a steel plate works, and the difference is the reason the vest can be soft. A plate stops a bullet by being harder than the bullet. A woven aramid panel stops a bullet by catching it in a net. The projectile strikes the outer layer and begins to deform, flattening as it pushes into the weave. Each yarn it touches pulls on the yarns crossing it, and the energy of the impact spreads outward through the fabric far faster than the bullet itself is traveling. Layer after layer absorbs and disperses that energy until the round runs out of momentum and stops, held in a shallow crater of deformed cloth. It is not armor in the medieval sense. It is a trap. By the mid-1970s, the Justice Department was running field trials, distributing vests to officers across a number of American cities and collecting data on whether they would actually be worn during a full shift, which had always been the point. The federal government issued performance standards defining what a vest had to stop in order to be certified, and the commercial industry grew up around manufacturing to those standards. DuPont later established what it called the Kevlar Survivors Club, documenting cases in which the fiber was credited with saving an officer's life. The membership passed 1,000 and then 2,000 and has since passed 3,000. 3,000 people went home who would not otherwise have gone home because of a batch of liquid that a technician in Delaware initially refused to put into his machine. The woman who made that liquid received none of the money. Stephanie Kwolek signed her patents over to DuPont. This was not a betrayal, and it was not unusual. It was the standard arrangement of corporate industrial research in the middle of the 20th century, and it remains the standard arrangement today. A company funds the laboratory, pays the salary, provides the equipment, and owns whatever comes out. She had agreed to it when she took the job she had intended to keep for 2 years. Kevlar became a business measured in hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Kwolek received her salary, and in common with other DuPont scientists, no royalty on the product. What is notable is how she talked about it afterward, because she talked about it for almost 50 years, and she never once framed it as a grievance. In interview after interview, she returned to the same point, which was that people were alive who would not have been, and that this was a thing very few scientists ever get to say about their work. She spent much of her later career and her retirement encouraging young women into chemistry, and she was direct about the fact that when she started at DuPont in 1946, there were almost no women in industrial research laboratories in the United States, and that the ones who were there were expected to be grateful and quiet. Recognition came late, and it came in the form of medals rather than money. She was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in the 1990s, one of very few women admitted at that time. She received the National Medal of Technology in 1996 and the Perkin Medal, one of the highest honors in American industrial chemistry, the following year. She held or shared more than 24 patents. She died in June of 2014 at the age of 90, having outlived the technician who spun her first thread, most of the executives who commissioned the tire project, and a considerable number of the people whose lives her fiber saved. And within a decade of her greatest recognition, the industry she had created decided it had found something better than Kevlar, and American police officers began getting shot through their vests again. The replacement was a fiber called Xylon, developed in Japan and manufactured by the Toyobo Corporation. On paper, it was a straightforward improvement. Xylon was stronger than aramid fiber by a substantial margin, which meant a vest could be built from fewer layers, which meant it could be thinner, lighter, and cooler to wear. That last property mattered more than it might appear. The single greatest determinant of whether body armor saves a life is not what it can stop in a laboratory. It is whether the officer is wearing it at the moment he is shot. Vests that are hot and bulky come off in August. A vest that is thinner and lighter is a vest that stays on, and manufacturers who had spent 30 years fighting that battle understood exactly what Xylon offered. Through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Xylon-based vests took a significant share of the American market. Second Chance Body Armor, a Michigan company founded by Richard Davis that had been one of the pioneers of the soft armor industry, built its premium line around the new fiber. Other manufacturers followed. Departments upgraded. Officers who had spent years in heavy vests put on lighter ones. On the 23rd of June 2003, an officer named Ed Limbacher of the Forest Hills Police Department outside Pittsburgh was shot in the abdomen during an exchange of gunfire. He was wearing a Xylon vest rated to stop the round that hit him. It went through. Limbasher survived. The vest did not perform as it was rated to perform, and it had not been damaged or misused. It had simply been worn for a couple of years, in the conditions in which police vests are actually worn. The investigation that followed established the failure mode, and it is a quiet one. Xylon degrades. Exposure to heat, to humidity, and to light breaks down the fiber's molecular structure over time, and a vest loses ballistic capability while looking outwardly identical. There is no visible warning. The vest that a patrol officer keeps against his body in summer, that rides in a car trunk in August, that gets sweated into every shift, was losing its ability to stop a bullet month by month, and nothing about it looked any different. Second Chance pulled its Xylon products. The company filed for bankruptcy protection the following year. The Justice Department launched a formal review of body armor safety, and the study that followed concluded that Xylon-based armor could not be relied upon to maintain its rated performance over a normal service life. Federal certification was withdrawn from Xylon vests, and in 2008, a revised national standard was issued which, for the first time, required armor to be artificially aged and conditioned before testing, rather than tested new out of the box. That last change is the durable legacy of the episode, and it is worth stating plainly. Before Xylon, the American standard measured what a vest could do on the day it was made. After Xylon, it measured what a vest could do after it had been treated as vests are actually treated. The failure did not just remove one fiber from the market, it changed what the word certified means. The old fiber, meanwhile, went back to work. Aramid armor was heavier, hotter, and less impressive on a specification sheet, and it had one property that no laboratory test had been designed to measure, which was that it did not quietly stop working while nobody was looking. Modern armor uses aramid fibers, ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, and various combinations of the two. And the fiber Stephanie Kwolek pulled out of a cloudy beaker in 1965 remains in production more than half a century later. If a police officer walks past you this week, there is a good chance that somewhere under the uniform shirt is a panel of woven fabric descended directly from a batch that a technician in Wilmington, Delaware, did not want to put in his machine. So look at the thing again. A company in Delaware wanted lighter tires because it was worried about the price of gasoline. It gave the problem to a chemist who had been steered away from clothing by her seamstress mother, who had taken the job to save money for a medical degree she never pursued, and who stayed for 40 years. She produced a solution that every rule of her field said was ruined, and she took it to a man who told her, correctly and reasonably, that it would damage his equipment. He said no. She kept asking. The thread that came out did not break, and both of them assumed the machine was broken instead. The cloudiness they had both read as contamination was rigid molecules lining themselves up in the beaker. The thinness they had both read as failure was those same molecules sliding past each other in formation. The two things that made it look like a mistake were the two things that made it the strongest fiber anyone had ever made. It went into tires and gloves and boat hulls and the cable under your street. Then a program manager at the Justice Department asked what would happen if you shot at it. And a soft panel of woven cloth solved a problem that steel plate had never been able to solve. Because the problem was never really about stopping bullets. It was about building something an officer would still be wearing at 4 p.m. in July. 30 years later, the industry found a fiber that was stronger, thinner, and lighter, and it turned out that stronger, thinner, and lighter was not the whole of the question either, and officers were shot through vests that had been silently dying in the heat. Stephanie Kwolek never took $1 of royalty on any of it. When she was asked about that, for nearly 50 years, she talked instead about the number of people who were alive. The strongest fiber ever made was not invented for soldiers. It was invented to save gasoline, it was nearly poured down a drain, and it exists because a chemist refused to accept that a batch was ruined just because it looked ruined, and because a man who had every reason to say no eventually said yes. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Fabric Myths, because almost every fiber you own has a story like this one buried in it, and most of them are stranger than you would guess. Tell me 2 things in the comments. First, which part of this surprised you most? Because for most people, it is either the fact that Kevlar was designed for tires, or the fact that the cloudiness was the whole reason it worked. And second, where in the world you are watching from, because this fabric is now worn on every continent, and I'm always curious how far it travels. Then tell me which fiber you want next, and if you want the other half of this story, the one about the DuPont laboratory in Delaware, a generation earlier, the chemist who invented nylon and did not live to see what it did, go watch the history of nylon. Riots over a pair of stockings. It is the same building, the same company, and a very different ending.